Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those of you who are on the other side of the Atlantic. And my name is Hildegunn Chivik Nordas, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Council on Economic Policies to this webinar, which is entitled The Digital Protocol in the AfCFTA, so that's the African Continental Free Trade Area, and it will talk about the digital protocol and also the JSI on e-commerce, which is negotiated in the WTO. And it's the first of a series of webinars, and we have called this series e-commerce, trade and development, an inclusive and interoperable policy framework. And we have a great panel, and we have a great moderator, which is Bernard Hoekman, and he is the Director of Global Economics at Hubert Schuman Center at the European University Institute. And just one final housekeeping. So participants are very much welcome to raise questions in the Q&A, and we will pick them up and distribute them to the panelists. So Bernard, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Hildegunn. Well, welcome to everyone who is on the call. Hildegunn already introduced the topic, so we're going to be talking about the digital protocol in the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we're going to also be talking about what is happening in the WTO on e-commerce, on digital trade. The panelists have been asked to reflect on a number of questions. I think all of you have seen the announcement of the seminar, know what they are. But just very briefly, we're going to talk about how is the implementation of this protocol going to change things on the ground in Africa for African firms, African consumers in terms of opportunities, but also we're going to talk about some of the main challenges that are going to have to be addressed in order to realize those opportunities and those potential benefits, with a particular focus on what's in it for small firms, right? What's in it for micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, and how is the protocol going to help those firms actually improve their ability to trade? And then finally, what's the link and what is the potential for connecting what is happening inside Africa through the African Continental Free Trade Area to what's happening more globally, in particular in the WTO, in this joint statement initiative negotiations on e-commerce. And I think here one of the stylized facts that will motivate the discussion is that most African countries have not joined the e-commerce talks in the WTO, right? And so I think one question we should be asking ourselves is, why is that the case? What's wrong with the WTO discussion, or what's wrong with the focus in the AfCFTA context? But again, I think that's an open question we will be talking about. So we have four great panelists to talk about these issues. And we're not going to follow the order in the announcement, but we're going to first focus on the African Continental Free Trade Area dimension. Geoffrey Ekwepi is going to kick us off. He's with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in the African Trade Policy Center and has been involved in the whole process. He's going to be followed by Michel Wambua, who is a Kenyan national based in Nairobi, but who works with GIZ, Germany, the German Technical Assistance Organization. Then we'll hear from Franziska Zucker, who is at Witwatersrand University in South Africa, who is an international trade lawyer and will speak from her perspective on what's happening both in Africa and outside Africa. And finally, Antonia Karazaniga, who is a senior counselor at the WTO and has been involved in trade-in services for a very long time at the WTO and who is following the e-commerce negotiations at the WTO. So let's start with Geoffrey. over to you.
No, thank you, Bernard. I will try to share my screen. So when you see my PPT, please let me know.
All good.
That's great. Okay. So first of all, I'm very happy to be here to discuss about digital protocol in AfCFTA. Let me start by giving some figures about the promises of AfCFTA. As we all know, AfCFTA will truly be transformative for Africa's trade and, generally speaking, overall speaking, for welfare in Africa. It will, of course, drive change in trade in goods, but not only, but also trade in services. At ECA, we led some work to assess the impact of AfCFTA on trade. And what we found is that AfCFTA is expected to increase trade by 45%, intra-African trade. And most notably, some sectors will be impacted. Agri-food, industrial sectors, and also services sectors will be impacted by the implementation of AfCFTA. Let me focus only on services sectors because of the link between services sectors and digital tools. What we observe, and you can see it in the graph, is that finance, business, and communication services are likely to see the most significant impact, and these services rely extensively on digital means. Digital means are important for finance, for business, for communication, not only also for tourism, but yes, it gives how to say, it's highlighted the huge potential for AfCFTA to impact trade in Africa, but also it reminds us that a strong digital environment, especially robust digital regulatory framework, could unlock even more growth in both goods and services trade across the continent. At ECA, with the collaboration of OECD, we collect data on the digital services restrictiveness index for African countries. And this index look at the barrier that can prevent or restrict firms from delivering services through digital networks. So with this index, we can identify what are the measures which restrict, what are the regulatory measures which restrict trade, digital trade in Africa. And since we now have the digital protocol adopted, we need also to know how the protocol responds to these identified restrictive regulation. So let me show you the nature of regulatory burden faced by African firms in the digital internal market. And if you look at this picture, which show the main barrier to digital trade, you can see that most of the regulatory restrictions that are in Africa are related to infrastructure and connectivity. Currently, half of the restrictions that we observe are related to infrastructure and connectivity. And what are these restrictions? We have limitation or prohibition of data transfer. We have, in many countries, lack of data protection laws framework. We have also some restriction in terms of communication in some country. And this restriction of communication concern internet access, and sometimes some social media are blocked. And we can understand very easily how social media can help small enterprises to advertise their product, but also to sell their products. So this is where the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol becomes critical, because it stresses the need for open, non-restrictive data governance, and it encourages member states to allow cross-border data flow without requiring the use of local servers or computing facility as a condition for conducting digital trade. These statements are in Article 20, 21, and 22 for references. And we recommend at ECA that as member states work on drafting the annex for cross-border data transfer under the protocol, it will be essential to tackle these challenges highlighted here, and also to use the Malabo Convention. The Malabo Convention is about cybersecurity and personal data protection, to use it at a starting point framework to draft to implement the protocol, and to draft some rules which will allow to transfer data more easily within the continent. Give me just 2 minutes to talk about another study that we led, which identified the priority policies for promoting digital trade within the continent. So this study is based on what we call RDTII. RDTII is an index that we collect with the assistance of the European University Institutes. And this index measures the current regulatory environment in the continent. It measures if the regulatory environment impedes trade or not. And we have two metrics under this index. We can draw two metrics under this index. First one is, properly speaking, the index, which vary from 0 to 1. 1 means that the country regulatory framework is restrictive to digital trade, and 0 means that the regulation is open to digital trade. We can also have a second matrix, which is the count number of the regulatory measures which are restrictive. So with these two metrics, we run an econometric analysis to examine how digital trade regulation can affect digital trade, intra-African digital trade. And what we found is quite interesting. We found that out of the 12 policy areas that we analyzed and that structure the index, we found that 8 of them are relevant, are significant and positive for significantly impact intra-African trade. What are these policy areas? It is public procurement, domestic data protection, and standard procedure. So we categorize them between three categories. Those policy areas which affect efficiently digital trade among African countries, those who have medium impact and those who have medium low impact. And from these results, we draw some recommendations that I want to share with you, and I will stop there. We see that, for example, in the protocol, the countries didn't negotiate rules or regulation that govern public procurement. So public procurement is out of the scope of the protocol. But what we found in our analysis is that rules governing public procurement is very important for digital trade, and in fact, it's increased when we reduce restriction in this area. It increased digital trade among African countries. So we recommend that member states could consider measures to facilitate participation in public procurement processes for African firm, not only the domestic one, but also the others firm across the continent. So I will stop there, and thank you very much. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thanks, Geoffrey, for a very data-driven presentation, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of the findings of the analysis. I'm particularly intrigued by this procurement point and how we should interpret that. So now let's go to Michel. Over to you.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Geoffrey, also for that presentation. In the next 7 or so minutes, my presentation or my thought process is focused around 3 main thematic areas of questions. First, just a general overview of what the AfCFTA is and the Digital Trade Protocol. Then, at least highlighting 3 main promises from the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol and 3 main challenges, at least how I see it. In terms of the AfCFTA, I think much has been said about it, and we are all familiar that it's the African Continental Free Trade Area agreement that seeks to make the African continent a single market. In terms of the Digital Trade Protocol, at least so far, and in terms of the other AfCFTA protocols, 48 of the 54 African member states of the African Union have signed and ratified the AfCFTA agreement. So this means that about 89% of the membership has signed and ratified the AfCFTA agreement. And out of the 55 members of the African Union, only 1 is yet to sign it, that's Eritrea. And so 54 have signed, 48 have ratified. What then this means is that the 48 that have ratified the AfCFTA agreement have also ratified the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol. To give you just a very brief overview of how the process has been, the negotiations were conducted in phases. So phase 1 included trade in goods and trade in services. And now phase 2 included thematic areas of competition protocol, the digital trade protocol, the investment protocol, and the intellectual property rights protocol. Now, particularly on the digital trade protocol, so far the protocol itself is in place, and at least by the reading of the protocol, we expect that there will be 8 annexes to give further life to the protocol. We know at least that it may not be, it hasn't formally been published yet, but we've seen that some of the most recent drafts have been circulated publicly, though not yet formally published. But from a look at the protocol and also discerning from what may be contained in the 8 annexes, at least from where I see it, I think there are 3 big promises or 3 potential benefits of the protocol and its annexes. The first is what is common with any FTA, that it will create a single market which will reduce the barriers related to digital trade, thus lowering the costs, removing bureaucracy, and promoting an open and interoperable system for digital platforms. So that's really typically the same benefit that you'd get in any other FTA, I would think. A single market, reduced bureaucracy, reduced processes among the members. But one thing that may be unique to the Digital Trade Protocol is that it seeks to harmonize some of the national legislations in Africa, and in fact require some countries to develop some national legislations insofar as rules and standards relating to data governance are concerned. Now, in the continent, there are countries that have rules and standards on data governance, and there are others that do not. So it's a 3-pronged problem. One, some countries have real rules and standards related to data governance, others do not. The countries that have rules and standards on data governance have not necessarily spoken to each other about what the best minimum standard is. And so from that perspective, you see that there's fragmentation and among those that have the laws, and there are some that don't have the law. So the promise that the Digital Trade Protocol has is that it will harmonize these frameworks, these national legislations, such that at least countries can have a minimum standard on rules and regulations relating to digital trade. The other big benefit possibly with the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol is it has a huge emphasis on local content requirements, African-owned enterprises. It really seeks to ensure that enterprises engaging in digital trade in the continent are African-owned. Now, we'll get into African-owned when I talk about the challenges, but From here, you can see one of the greater benefits here is that it seeks to ensure that there are homegrown industries in the digital space, that industries that take part in the digital market are homegrown, and this could potentially mean greater tech transfer by multinational entities and non-repatriation of profits. We know that the problem that some of the OECD countries are addressing in relation to base erosion and profit shifting, whereby multinational entities engaging in the digital services space sometimes or often repatriate their profits to tax havens. So in that sense, the Digital Trade Protocol is really emphasizing that an entity engaging in the digital space must be homegrown, and this will possibly mean more tech transfer on the continent, more homegrown industries, and greater collaboration with the local industries. But now, in the last 2.5 minutes, allow me to focus on what I think could be some of the potential challenges. Much as one of the annexes we expect is the Rules of Origin Annex, which quite honestly may be one of the most innovative aspects of the Digital Trade Protocol and actually ambitious. At least to my mind, I'm yet to see any jurisdiction that has a Rules of Origin for digital trade. It could pose some significant challenges because there's a potential that the way it will be designed is using a beneficial ownership test. So how rules of origin shall be determined is on the basis of beneficial ownership, which essentially means who owns the company that is engaging in the digital marketplace. Now, why this is a significant challenge is because we know, at least from past experience and from traditional market approaches, that companies often find a way to bypass beneficial ownership tests through nominee shareholding, for example, convertible debt structures, holding companies, and many other sophisticated tax and legal structures that ensure that a company bypasses a beneficial ownership test. So insofar as the rules of origin exists, it's innovative, yes, but if it's designed in a way that ensures that the test that is to be applied is a beneficial ownership test, the big promise of African-owned enterprises may not be realized, because what will happen is multinational entities will invariably find a way to bypass this. The second challenge, insofar as the Digital Trade Protocol is concerned, is the usual technical challenges. And here I use technical as a broad term. Here I'm thinking from as simple as some of the internet connectivity issues we have on the continent, across the continent. This internet connectivity issue is one of the simple, I would say simple technical challenges, but there are more difficult challenges in the continent. So for example, technical understanding of digital platforms and digital frameworks and how they operate. And we've seen this in many instances, in many regulations across the continent. We know a common example, sometimes funny, of a country within the continent that wanted to ensure that WhatsApp administrators register formally with the government. So we have governments that sometimes do not necessarily understand how digital platforms work, how they operate. And so this will or may pose a challenge to the implementation of the Digital Trade Protocol. The final challenge I foresee, much as I've talked about the promise being harmonization and regulatory alignment, this may also be a challenge to get the countries to agree on what is the basic and minimum standard in data governance, what standard of cybersecurity is required, exchange of information between governments. Getting to yes, to put it that way, may be a challenge that we may see in the coming days or in the coming years. But I'll stop there for now and hand it over to you, Bernard.
Okay, thanks a lot for those remarks, Michelle. I wasn't really aware of the link to ownership, so I think we'll probably come back to that in terms of the discussion, and maybe also in terms of the consistency between those provisions in the protocol and what we're seeing the focus being on in the e-commerce talks in the WTO. Okay, so now let's go to Francisca.
Thanks so much also, and thanks, Michael, as he has covered a couple of things that he and I discussed a few times already, specifically with regards to the rules of origin. But let me focus then on how the role of the DTP can bring African priorities maybe to multilateral rulemaking, and put the link to the last speaker. So when you look at that question, bringing African priorities to multilateral rulemaking, the first thing that appears is African perspectives and priorities are very diverse. So it's not just about the numbers of 45 countries, it's also a lot of economic, political diversity that is reflected in current, let me say, a highly fragmented regulatory landscape. And yes, we have seen that some have not yet national regulation of data protection, but that has expanded like dramatically, specifically in the past decade. So when we look at data transfer laws, they have not just expanded significantly, but they're also very diverse. So we look at laws requiring processing data locally versus conditional requirements for data transfer or light transfer. So you have very different kind of approaches of regulating that. And when you look more specifically to personal data transfer, you have all the three models that we know out there, like the conditional, the control model, the open model. So that means that we have a very diverse regulatory approach towards data governance. So that's why the first question is, what is actually an African priority, right? So can we actually speak of some focus on control, essential security, sometimes on censorship, some focus on digital inclusion, and so on. So I think that is the first big question that needs to be answered. And the second point in that regard is that none of the African countries that have signed PTAs on digital trade so far have committed to like binding or non-binding horizontal commitments when it comes to free flow of data, which has 2 points to make. One is, on the one side it's sad, on the other side it's lucky sad, because it kind of highlights the absent from the digital rulemaking on international scene. But on the other side, it's maybe lucky because it does mean that it doesn't deepen the fragmentation in rules on data flow so far. I'm concerned about the fragmentation because it does have negative consequences for African businesses in terms of high compliance costs and reduced access to global value chains and so on. And it also prevents that, that those commitments are not yet there, that the conflicting commitments, and also, let's say, compromising own like goals at the continental level that has been acknowledged early on. So what is now the role here for the data digital protocol? And I think it is that what Michael already said, steering towards regulatory convergence, maybe providing a consolidated Pan-African approach to how to regulate it. What does that? What benefit does it give African countries? I say negotiating as a single bloc gives them more bargaining power, which also means that it could increase their collective bargaining power, to the ability of advocating for what they think it's important, which is currently absent in many of the also regional trade agreements, plurilateral trade agreements. That means to address the diverse level of digital development. So you have very few rules yet there, and I'm also highlighting their competition rules that are very important to include, to protect SMEs, the capacity building, tech assistant, digital infrastructure, those kind of things, access to equitable technology. So that's what they can advocate for. It would also increase the confidence in participating, which means an increased participation generally, in the sense of an early on participation, which avoids that one just gets later on in the process impositions of already rules that are maybe not beneficial, and then the struggle of actually including that later, what one actually is interested in. Overall, it does contribute to withstand external pressure, to follow one of the three data governance approaches out there, China, EU, US. We know that most of the rules, we have a lot of focus on the conditional data flow approach in Africa, which Martina Ferracana already said in a very recent study that is actually not beneficial for intra-African trade to follow this. It's very much from the EU and GSI, sorry, Michael, imposed. And so that would strengthen the ability to actually put on own or maybe different approaches to regulate things, not to speak of the point that it would be more inclusive. So if more, obviously, if more African countries would enter the international stage to regulate digital trade issues, multilateral, it would be giving GSI or other initiatives more legitimacy and be more representative. But let me address the question in my remaining 2.5 minutes, because I do look after the minutes. Is there actually something in the DTP? What is different? So the question is not so much is there an African approach, because I don't think that this is the case, but is there something different to offer that maybe speaks to the needs that they have, or something different to find? And yeah, there is here and there. So I'm not matching now rules on origin again, like Michael did so far, but maybe a point to them is that it is quite curious how it's defined in the annexures that I also have seen, that they probably stay like this, because what does it imply to have rules of origin that way? It does imply that state parties do intend to actually raise customs on digital delivered services from non-African origin. That is very clear. South Africa's position, it was always very clear on that, and I think that's exactly what they intend to do. What does it mean for the GSI negotiations? There may not agree to moratoriums, but may insist on including rules of origins, something like this. We can discuss that later on. But in my opinion, that's actually detrimental for SMEs, because the majority of inputs that they need coming from outside the continent at the moment. That means having customs potentially on those digital services that they still need in order to grow, would again increase costs, not to speak of the internal high costs that rules of origin in that sense would mean. We have very interesting, as a difference, very interesting provisions for data flows. We have a specific provision to support and establish domestic data centers in 22.3, which is the result of conflicting views between the states on data localization. As I said, South Africa very strong there, others not. So we have at least that, which is interesting to support that. We have an exception included in the annex for sensitive data, which is a very African thing to do, because if one looks at data protection laws and those data transfers in national laws, you find that sensitive data always has a very prominent place to play. So I think that is reflected in the annex as well. The standard for data protection as exception is the normal way and clarified in the annex as well, so that's great. But essential security interests are also not further defined, which I see a little bit as a risk. The next thing that maybe stands out is the digital inclusion provision, very much like in the DPA, follows that, reflecting the needs internally in Africa, and a good, not typically seen in other digital trade agreements, provisions on technical assistance and capacity building, and even a hard obligation on cooperation with listed aims. In the GSI, there's not such a hard obligation, and it's just like shall encourage, but here we have those obligations, which I think can be built on. Interoperability is very prominent in all the sectors, and my time runs a bit out, but what is also interesting is a very extensive chapter on digital trade facilitation, focusing on how to update the regulatory provisions within the nations. I have a lot of other comments. The time is running out. But maybe we can do that in the questions and answers, because the question is, can actually the protocol do steer towards like consolidated approach with the way it is regulated. A point there might be still that the way it is done is the very typical digital trade agreements with substantive obligations, exceptions, and the exceptions are formulated in the style of the trade rules. That means you have the regulatory autonomy to use those rules within the known realms of things. I leave it there and maybe use the rest for the question and answers. Thanks you.
Thanks a lot for that. So again, I think lots of interesting questions we can discuss. But let's go to Antonia first, and then we can come back on some of the points that have been raised by all three of you. Antonia.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are, to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First, let me just say a quick caveat. I work for the WTO Secretariat, but my views are personal. They do not reflect the views of official views of the Secretariat, or even worse, those of its members. So it's very much my personal opinion here. So what I plan to touch upon is mainly three main issues. First, what is in the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, not in any detail, but also because, you know, as the text is sort of out there, but not publicly released. So I think what is particularly impressive is that the AfCFTA has been able to agree disciplines in areas where the JSI in the WTO has failed. So it's gone further than the JSI, particularly when it comes to the data flow measures, localization of computing facilities, access to source code. So those are areas where JSI members have not been able to come to convergence on the current text, although they have a sort of rendezvous clause to look at those issues in a second stage. It also incorporates areas that are found maybe more in what are known as digital economy agreements, sort of new areas, not necessarily exclusively focused on trade, but they generally facilitate activities conducted over electronic means. So for instance, digital identities or inclusion or emerging technologies. So areas that are not very frequent in regional trade agreements elsewhere, but that we've seen maybe more in this sort of Singapore-sponsored digital economy agreement. But then also what is striking is what is there with brackets or there sort of partially, which is the provision on cross-border data flows. Sorry, the provision on the moratorium on the non-application of customs duty to electronic transmissions, which is currently bracketed, at least in what I've seen, which maybe goes some way towards explaining the reluctance of some African members to participate in the JSI, pure speculation on my part, but clearly that's an area that's been sensitive in the African context. And then, yes, there are rules on data flows, but they, like in other RTAs, they're accompanied by these sort of broad exception on legitimate public policy objectives, which are not defined, although I understand there is an intention of defining those, and there are specific annexes that will be developed on that. So it's not immediately clear how horizontally applicable those obligations on cross-border data flows will be. And then one other point that maybe I would highlight is the fact that the protocol indicates that other protocols take precedence, which again is not unusual. Many RTAs do that. So how the interplay between what is in the digital trade protocol and, for example, the services protocol, where there are many still limitations, many such limitations exist. That's something that will need to be worked out in practice. Or as the negotiations on the annexes advance. Second point, maybe it's about the implementation and the impact that this could be. So what we see and we know is that Africa's export of digitally delivered services account for a very small share, less than 1% of total exports of digitally delivered services. We don't have data for digitally ordered trade that's internationally comparable. That's why we tend to measure the services side, the deliverable side of digital trade. But we also know that that share is growing faster, or was growing faster than the rest of the world, and it's certainly growing faster than traditional trade in goods and trade in other services. So clearly that's an upward trajectory that we see, and also some African countries have been performing particularly well. Morocco, Ghana, South Africa, for example, Egypt have performed especially well when it comes to digitally delivered services. So the opportunities are many. There are also obviously challenges, and we've done some work in the context of a joint initiative with the World Bank on digital trade for Africa, where the Secretariat and the World Bank have sort of pooling together resources to try and assist the efforts that African countries are doing to leverage the opportunities and address the challenges of digital trade. And, you know, there's a lot that could be said, but in essence, what we see, or what we have seen so far, is that connectivity in terms of access to the internet has significantly increased in Africa. There's been a huge progress done over the last 10 years. Maybe not as much progress has been made in terms of affordability and quality of those that internet access, but certainly the access to the internet has improved significantly. But of course, the challenge is putting that access to productive use. And so there are particular challenges with regard to skills. And then another thing that emerges is sort of, if you will, the regulatory environment that can foster and facilitate digital trade. And there, for example, our colleagues in economic research have done some work by looking at how trade costs would be affected if connectivity, hard connectivity, were to improve to the level of South Africa, which is the best connectivity in Africa. And they estimated that to result on average in a fall in trade costs for goods of 7%. And a higher 9% fall in average trade costs for business and professional services. But then they looked at the same impact if, in addition to improved connectivity, we also had an improved regulatory framework. And there the results are much higher. So if at the same time you improve the connectivity, but also improve the regulatory framework, trade costs would actually fall by 17% for goods and by 25% on average for business and professional services. So that sort of points to the fact that working on infrastructure alone doesn't maximize the benefits, and you want to kind of not sequence the two, but try and do the two together. So, you know, I can say more about what we've seen so far in the work we've done with some African countries in terms of where the regulatory framework is. But it is clear that there are a number of challenges. You know, a lot of action is taking place in setting up, for example, online consumer protection frameworks, cybersecurity legislation, electronic signatures, and so on. But sometimes the implementation and the adoption are what is limiting the benefits of this work. Coming maybe the third point to what is happening in the JSI, you know, I already sort of did a very broad-brushed comparison between what is happening in the JSI and what provisions we have there and what is in the AfCFTA. But I think one sort of 2 points maybe to raise at this stage, and then we can discuss further. One is that the AfCFTA has technical assistance provisions. So does the JSI. Although, of course, they're not as binding, and maybe some of the developing countries participating would have wanted. But there is certainly something on offer there to try and implement or upgrade the regulatory framework for digital trade. So that's an opportunity that exists for JSI participants that could also be beneficial in an AfCFTA context. And then the second question, maybe it's, you know, it goes into a little bit of the discussion on rules of origin, but some elements are clearly applicable on a non-MFN basis, but others may be more by de facto applicable on an MFN basis, even in the AfCFTA context. So if you develop a framework for digital signatures, you're not going to distinguish between whether your suppliers are coming from African countries or otherwise. So I think there is certainly value in what is happening at the regional base, at the regional level, in meeting some of the same, or even further, the provisions that are in the JSI, regardless of whether the African countries choose to participate in the JSI or not. So I think it's kind of two efforts that can be seen as complementary. And I'll stop there for now. Many thanks.
Thank you, Antonia. That's very, very clear. I just have one clarification question because that confused me a bit. So there's non-application of customs duties. Is that in the digital protocol as well?
It is, but as far as I understand, it's in square brackets, so not agreed as yet.
Okay, so can you guys confirm? So the digital protocol is not done, right? Is that seems to be the implication? It's not finalized. Yeah, Francisca, go ahead.
Just to say, it's a draft, right, as adopted. So it's only when a specific amount of signatures have ratifications are in, then it's enforced. But the likelihood of the content changing as it stands now is very low. So the content will stay. It just waits until there are enough ratification documents in.
Okay, so there are no square brackets then. It's just a function of ratification.
I think they will be then removed because when the annexes are published, will be published in a few weeks or a couple of days or next month. So then they will be removed.
Okay.
So I saw the non-official version, obviously.
Yeah, maybe Bernard, just to make a comment on that. The reason why there's this confusion is because, like I said earlier, it hasn't been formally published. So what's online is it's a true version, but it hasn't been formally published by the Secretariat yet. But like Francisca is saying, it won't change, or we don't expect it to change.
Okay. Good. So, I mean, so everybody who is listening in on this, feel free to ask questions, use the Q&A option. We have one question, which is maybe more for Antonia in the Q&A, which relates to Global Privacy Assembly, which has done a lot of work on harmonization. But the question is there a link to the WTO process on that or not? So maybe you can address that, and then we'll kind of continue.
Yes, thank you very much. Not that I'm aware of. I've not seen any joint work or any information from that feeding into at least the official, let's say, discussions under the WTO framework. It's possible that that might be something that could be brought, and actually that was one point I wanted to make, that we're focusing very much on the JSI, but we also have a multilateral process ongoing at the WTO under the work program on electronic commerce. So I don't know if that's where that could be also brought, if the information there could be helpful to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So in the absence of other questions, do the panelists want to ask each other anything? Or discuss, contest? I noticed that Francisca said she has been talking to Michel about this rule of origin business. I must confess, as a trade person, I'm very confused as to how you would actually make this work in a way that would not be completely arbitrary and ad hoc. So I don't know if there's been thinking on that. But to me, it's pretty clear when we're talking about goods. If we're talking about services, you're in a completely different world. So if the objective really is to make this preferential and to benefit African firms, I think it's going to be, we already have a lot of challenges in terms of fragmentation and so forth, but I would imagine that is going to be a huge challenge in and of itself. So anyway, thoughts on that would be welcome.
I'm happy to jump in here. So far, what we know, we haven't seen what the final annex will look like, but there's speculation that it will be a beneficial ownership test, which means that essentially you'll be looking at the company that is engaging in the digital trade or that owns the digital platform, and you look to whether who owns this company, who owns the majority of the shares in this company. So you're an African-owned enterprise if, say, for example, majority of your shareholding is owned by an African person, legal or natural. And of course, we know the challenges with this. The challenges, like I highlighted, being that multinational entities know how to go around beneficial ownership tests. And they've been doing this for years. It's one of the things that gives tax lawyers the money to hit their pools. So this sort of arrangement may be difficult. And as to whether a digital trade is a good or a service, again, this is also another thing that hasn't quite been made clear. Previously, some of the speakers spoke about definitions being weak. Some African countries are very firm on this position, like South Africa. To South Africa, digital trade is a service. Other countries don't have a position on this. Others are yet to be quite clear whether it's a good, whether it's a service, whether it's a mix of both. So that, I think, also affects the development of the protocol and its annexes.
Good. That seems to me very much a first order question. Francisca, and then Antonia.
So I'm not, it's exactly like Michael said with the rules of origin. I think it will increase a lot of compliance costs, specifically internally, and the way they formulated the annexures is in itself quite redundant. So it's very confusing to actually get an understanding of it. Maybe one more point which is confusing is the non-discrimination provisions, because it was mentioned now with the MFN and NT, there is no exception. So whilst there are exceptions in the cross-border data flow provisions, the way we know them, not to the national treatment and MFN provisions, which begs the question where the limit there is. So can actually states justify a specific national treatment and the implications for regulatory autonomy in that regard? And to what was said, so how that provision is treated, because it's not tied in with the overall AfCFTA agreement. So it stands on its own. So there would be basically no way of justifying non-discrimination. I agree with the GSI to Antonia's point on the tech assistance. They will very much benefit from the fact that these 9 countries, that they are part of that, because I think there will be some work towards those 9 countries. And maybe one last point, what I wanted to highlight is in the internal documents, you can see a lot of highlighting of how that is how the provisions benefit MNEs. Oh no, sorry, my hand, I wanted to raise it down. But there is no consideration of how that potentially does the opposite and be disadvantageous. And I think that is a risk that hasn't been mentioned here too much. There's an internal inequality within Africa that has not been addressed in the protocol. And we can see that already, that there are just 5 countries that speed off with the numbers and that benefit from it. But there are no kind of mechanisms that are like that strong, that would prevent that and then take those different speeds into account. And one of the major things would be to tie in also competition rules, also internal ones in the competition protocol, which can be quite useful, that can be discussed in another time. But SNDT provisions, as an example, were advocated for by some countries internally and have not been successfully in the protocol. So it's not just like
Okay, I think the feared frozen moment has arrived for Francisca. So while she's coming back, Antonia,
so I think there's
we lost you there, so I don't. So the double phone technology is still not enough. Anyway, thanks for that. Let's go to Antonia briefly. I don't know if you've been reading the questions, Antonia. There are a couple of questions for you there. I think also for Geoffrey, there's a question. So if you could take a look at that, and then we'll come back to the questions in a bit. So Antonia.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment briefly on the goods versus services issue, and then I'll take a look at the questions maybe afterwards. there, I think the application of MFN and national treatment, well, particularly a national treatment there, it's, it's kind of very different depending on whether you consider this to be trading goods or trading services. Also because, as far as I could tell from the protocol, there is this notion that we find in other regional trade agreements that the provisions of the protocol do not override the provisions of, for instance, the services chapter. And so if under the services chapter there are limitations on national treatment, then those would override anything that's done in the protocol in the digital part. So that's another way of saying that at the end of the day, what seems to prevail is whatever conditions in terms of national treatment are bound in that particular services chapter rather than in the digital protocol. I can try and take a look at the questions now, or...
Well, why don't you read them and then we'll go
Thank you.
to somebody else on this. So, Michel, there's a couple of questions also there for you. One relates on regulatory autonomy, and I think there's the regulatory autonomy question, which then morphs or it maps into another question, which is, what is the process through which African countries are actually going to address this regulatory fragmentation? Are there specific mechanisms foreseen for that? Question here is, are there like single windows? Is that an approach? I would add to that, is there a thought of equivalence types of regimes, recognition? Because after all, everyone can harmonize, everyone can have the same law, but you still need to recognize that that law is being implemented, right? So anyway, so that's one question. How is this actually going to be pursued, this process of reducing the fragmentation?
I'm happy to jump in here, and I also saw the same question was posed to Fran. In terms of regulatory autonomy, the way the exceptions have been designed is much similar to how they're designed in the WTO, in the sense that the same general exceptions we tend to see in the WTO, public health, national security, public morals, have also been put into the document. And so then some policy space is left to the state parties in the sense of what a national security may be. So defining that may be left to the policy space of the state parties, but of course within the bounds of what the jurisprudence has shown to be a national security concern or to be a public health, public moral, and so on concern. But in terms of harmonization and equivalence, at least we've seen an attempt to have harmonization and equivalence on some of the areas, like, for example, digital identities. So how this will work in practice, I guess we'll wait and see, but there is an element that some of the areas of regulation, like digital identities, shall enjoy an equivalence regime.
Great. Thank you. Geoffrey, you want to take the question that was addressed to you? So essentially the question was, what's the approach towards addressing the various intellectual property rights? And is there going to be a push for a legal framework for data protection?
Yeah. No. Basically, the constat is, and it is right to say that there is a different rules concerning IPA in Africa. When we do our evaluation with our index, what we found is that actually many of African countries have some disparate, some different rules when it comes to IPA. I think the protocol promote, I didn't remember very well, the draft protocol, let's say promote the alignment with international laws. And so I think here, I'm not very aware of what is the official the official thinking about this, but what will be maybe my personal, not ECA recommendation, but my personal view of it is to, for African country, maybe to start to be in international copyright treaty like WIPO or online copyright enforcement things, or you know, WIPO performance and phonogram treaty. So to sign what exists globally in terms of IPR. Maybe that will create or give a general framework for African and align them with also a global thinking about IPR. So that will be my personal response, but I'm not very well aware of the institutional thinking, meaning African Union thinking about it. Maybe Michael will want to jump in on it also.
So the question is, how hard is this deadline that we have of 1 hour? Because we've reached 1 hour, so we can close it. We can close it here. Hildegun, you want to be tuchtig?
We can go on for 5 minutes if there is a lot more to be said, and then we can wrap it up.
Okay. So have you had a chance to look at the questions, everybody?
Maybe I can just jump in very quickly. I think
Yeah.
the question that was addressed to me was about regulatory frameworks. This is not work that we've done, but work that has been done by the World Bank in terms of who has the sort of most e-commerce friendly regulatory framework amongst African countries. After South Africa, it's countries like Kenya, like Morocco, like Egypt, Botswana. So these would be the countries that, based on the work that they have done, would have the most open or most digital trade friendly regulatory framework. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So then let's take one last question, which was to Francisca. I don't know if you've been able to read it, but essentially the question is, how are the data rules going to be enforced in practice? Right, and has there been any discussion about the implications for existing restrictions on conditions for transfer of personal data and the local processing requirements? So are those going to be lifted for other African countries, or is there a sense that current restrictions comply with the legitimate policy exception? And I think this goes a bit back to the discussion we've already had. So is this really going to be preferential, or is this just going to be seen as a general exception? So if everybody who wants to chip in on that question, give it 30 seconds and then we'll close. Francisca, you want to start?
Very briefly, yeah, it goes back to the question, the other in terms of regulatory autonomy. I did the exercise, and I think strict data localization bans would not be possible anymore by any country when you apply those rules. But pretty much every other data localization requirement would still be fine to have at the national level. So in terms of regulatory autonomy, there's a lot of leeway. There was another question to the threshold. It's 22, just to answer that quickly in between. And on the point of standard of data protection, there is a whole part 2 in the Annex 4, which lays out the conditions of how the data framework has to be of data protection, and a reference to that part that says if that standard is not fulfilled, you can restrict, and if it is fulfilled, you are not allowed to restrict, just to fill in that gap on that exception in the Annex.
Great, thank you. Michelle, last points.
Thanks, Bernard. My last point is a very general one, and I echo what Fran has said. Mine is on the WTO e-commerce JSI. Like Antonia, unfortunately, I can't guess why some countries haven't joined the JSI. But what we know is that there may be overlaps between the work being done in the Digital Trade Protocol, as it's called, and the e-commerce JSI at the WTO. And my personal view is that it would be beneficial for African state parties to join the WTO JSI so that there's a bit of harmony in the work that's being done. Thank you for your time.
No, I agree. I was kind of struck by the fact that most of the countries that are part of the JSI are all West African countries, which led to a question in my mind: is there something specific about that region, or who has influence in that region relative to what's going on in East and Southern Africa? But you don't need to address that. So Antonia, last words?
No, just to echo what Michel was saying, yes, I think there's a lot of complementarity. Actually, the protocol goes further than the JSI, so the question remains for me why, I'm not second guessing, but
Okay, thank you. So I think we've kept a track of the questions. Not all questions have been answered, but I think feel free to get in touch with the panelists bilaterally and maybe keep Hildegun involved. I don't know how you want to manage that, but obviously it will be good to populate the website with questions and responses to the extent that you're willing to give them. Okay, thanks again for a very interesting discussion. Obviously, there's huge agenda here in terms of future work, and it's going to be very interesting to see how it evolves. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
And from me also, thank you so much. And I'm very glad that we have a seminar or webinar series, because there are so many things to pick up and discuss further from this. So thank you all, and thank you from the audience as well.
I think you should have one on rules of origin.
Yes.